Okay, we're going to continue. Just pick up on page 80. Let's go through the summary again. Because there's a lot of important points to sweep up here. So we're looking at the summary on the chapter of the creation of the new Mass. And we saw that there was about 7 stages, according to Archbishop Bonini, to bring in the new Mass. And here's a summary of it. So take the first point there, Michael. Read loud and clear.
The New Order Mass, promulgated by Paul VI in 1969, was the product of a long process of liturgical change that began in 1948 with the appointment of the Piani Reform Commission.
Okay. So, began in 1948. That's when they started changing. Can you put that on low or off, please? Next point. So the whole revolution kicked in practically in 1948. Next point.
Annibale Bomini, who secretly supported the reform proposals of the left wing of the liturgical movement, directed the work commission and for 2 decades oversaw the process that created the new Mass. In 1975, he was suddenly removed from his Vatican post. The grounds for his dismissal was alleged membership in Freemasonry, a fact now regarded in the Vatican as certain.
Yeah, so here's a Freemason, the engineer of the new Mass, and he started the process in 1948. The strange thing is he was never fired. He should have been fired under Pius XII, because that's when he was really pushing his nonsense. But there was a time when Pope Pius XII was very sick for about 5 years at the end of his pontificate. Next point. At a secret meeting in 1948, Joseph Jungmann outlined his heart's dream for the reform of the Mass. This would be implemented in the 1969 Novus Ordo Missae. Jungmann became a consultor for the Pian Reform Commission. So his dream would be fulfilled with the new Mass. Because remember, Jungmann was this one that said the Tridentine Mass showed a corruption, a departure from the primitive Mass of the early Church. So one of the typical arguments of modernists. They did it in the early Church this way, we have to do it this way. But Pope Pius XII condemned that as what? In Media today.
The heresy of archaeologism?
Archaeologism, yeah. Which is, the early Church, in some rare cases, they received communion in the hand because of the persecutions, and they could bring Holy Communion to the next catacomb. So they did it in the early Church, so we got to do it now, which is just a bunch of baloney. Poor argument. And Pius XII condemned that argument. And his answer was, if they want to go back to the early practices of the early Church, let them go back to the early penances of the early Church. For your penance, you will kneel in front of the church in sackcloth and ashes, praying the 7 penitential psalms. You will fast for 10 days on bread and water and things like that. It was brutal penances. Next point, Gabriel.
The 1951 experimental Easter Vigil was Bonini said, the first step to a general liturgical reform. It introduced principles and practices that would finally be implemented across the board 18 years later in the Mass of Paul VI.
Yes, so who would have ever thought, the Easter Vigil implementation in 1951 was actually the beginning of their dirty work. But there it is. So remember, in the Easter Vigil, for the first time, the priest faces the people with a table in front of him, with the vessel holding the Easter water to be blessed. You've all seen that, right, at Easter Vigils? and the priest dunks the candle into the water, right? Well, that's usually done in the baptistry traditionally. But here Bonini put it in the front of the church. The priest turns around, faces the people, a table in front of him. So in itself, he's not saying Mass on that table, but he's planting the seeds for the new Mass. So people get used to seeing table, priest facing the people, and for the table in front of him, and the other details of Holy Week changes that were seeds for the new Mass. All right, next point, Andres.
The 1955 simplification of the rubrics, Bugnini said at the time, represented a turning point for the liturgy, the second stage of reform, a bridge to the future in making the liturgy a new city in which the man of our age can live and feel at ease. Those eager for a fuller renewal, Bugnini urged to keep their eyes open because liturgical reform would require the enlightened collaboration of all the active forces.
So look at all, this is just about every bit of his own words. This whole turning point, reform, bridge to the future, new city, all this talk of Utopia land, Disneyland, Disney World, Bonini Disney World, preparing it in 1955 for his new Mass. So did he have any doubts that these reforms of 1955 and up to even 62 and 60, did he have any doubts where they were going?
No.
He knew exactly where they were going. So now we got priests arguing, we got to stay with the 65 or stay with the 62 because it's traditional and but out of Bonini's mouth, he saw it only as a passage to the new Mass. So, and again, I say this a lot, but it's a point it's a powerful point. The 62 liturgy only lasted how long? 3 years. And then it was dumped and replaced with 65 changes. Then 67 changes. And then 69 with the new Mass. Next point. The 1955 renewed order for Holy Week introduced another series of changes that would be permanently incorporated into the new Mass. The new Holy Week rite, said Bonini himself in 1956, represented the third step towards a general liturgical reform. He calls it reform, we call it revolution, a complete overthrow of what's sacred. Next point, 1958, go ahead, Michael.
The 1958 instruction on sacred music allows still more practices that would be incorporated into the Novus Ordo. The recitation by people of the ordinary and proper of the Mass together with the priest, wider use of the vernacular, lay lectors and commentators, and the responsoral songs.
Yes, so more involvement of the laity. There you go. Next point.
The 1960 Code of Rubrics promulgated by John the 23rd, together with the Breviary and Missal of 1962 that accompanied it, were only temporary measures. Because of the need to change all the liturgical books once the council was over and put its decision into effect, it seemed prudent not to compel all the clergy to change those books now as well.
Yes, so they're getting ready to bring out new missals. So you notice that in the 1950s already, the new missals that are printed with the old Mass, but the new Holy Week of 55, you start seeing more and more ugly pictures coming up. Modern style, ugly, deformed pictures. That's all part of that liturgical wreckage that's Bonini was in charge of. Okay, next point.
The liturgical reforms introduced before Vatican II in the years 1948 to 62 and 1955 Holy Week rites in particular established numerous precedents for practices or principles that would be implemented across the board in the Mass of Paul VI. the vernacular as an integral part of the liturgy, reduction of the role of the priest, vocal participation by the laity, new liturgical roles, change in the prayers, ceremonies to accommodate modern needs, omitting duplications, omitting parts of the Ordo Missae, prescribing ceremonies facing the people, de-emphasizing the saints, change in text for ecumenical reasons, simplifying expressions of reverence for the Blessed Sacrament, and finally even changing the canon.
So yeah, they just chip away until there's nothing left. Death by 1,000 slices. Death by 1,000,000 paper cuts. Very smart of these Masons. And they said, we will infiltrate the church and we will destroy the Mass. Next point.
Annibale Bugnini, assisted by Josef Jungmann, was the principal author of the 1963 Vatican II Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy. While the Constitution contains much orthodox terminology and recommends some praiseworthy things, its creators deliberately salted it with ambiguous or equivocal statements. This yes, but that too, on one hand, on the other, and so on, that could later be used to implement radical changes. Hence, both the conservative and the progressive interpretations of the documents are simultaneously correct and incorrect.
Yeah, double-tongued. I have hated the double-tongued, says the Holy Ghost. And the doctrinal declaration signed by Bishop Fillet and sent to Rome on April 15th, 2012 was double-tongued. He himself admitted it. So Catholics they're allergic to double-tongued documents. Any honest man should be. Next point. For the Mass, the fateful paragraph in the Constitution on the Liturgy was paragraph 50. The principles it lays down are so broad they could be used to justify virtually any change. So, yes, paragraph 50. Right out of Vatican II. So, it's built into the documents of Vatican II, the destruction of the Mass. It's built right in. Next point, Michael.
In order to bypass the conservatives and the Roman Curia, Paul VI created a new agency to implement the liturgical changes, the Consilium, and put Bugnini in charge of its operation.
Yeah, so this is a new group called Consilium. Next point.
During the years 1964 to 1968, Consilium implemented two series of interim changes in the traditional order of Mass, oversaw the introduction of the vernacular throughout the Mass, permitted Mass facing the people, and introduced 3 new Eucharistic prayers as alternatives to the Roman canon.
Yes, so already in 65 and 67, they're turning the altar around to face the people. So, next point.
At the same time, a subcommittee of Consilium, Study Group 10, was at work formulating the new order of Mass. The group consisted of 12 members, among them, of course, Joseph Jungmann and Louis Boyer.
Yeah, these names keep reoccurring, don't they?
Yeah.
These modernists. So if you asked Bugnini, do you deny the real presence of Christ in the Blessed Sacrament? Well, of course not. Do you deny that the Mass is the sacrifice of Calvary? Well, of course not. How dare you even ask me? But then why are you changing it? Why are you bringing all these Protestant things? Oh, well, we have to adapt to the people. We have to adapt to the needs of the time.
We have to realize the other presences of Christ in our fellow men.
Yes. So that's all language of what?
The
Modernist language. They won't deny the Catholic doctrine openly and honestly, but they'll use every other deceptive language and weasel words to basically deny it and undermine it. Next point.
Consilium was assisted in its work by 6 Protestant observers.
Yeah, Protestant observers, were they just sitting there with folded arms? No. Bonini was asking them, so which part of the Christmas Mass offends you? Which part of the Easter Mass offends you? What part of the prayers of, the collects offend you? Well, we don't like this reference to penance. We don't like this reference to too much honor to the Virgin Mary. So they started taking out in the new Mass, Semper Virginis, always virgin. They just call her Virgin. Which Protestants can accept, because they'll say, yeah, she was virgin up until, after Christ was born, and then she had other children, they say. So it's not always virgin, which the Church, you'll notice every time they call her, traditionally, the Virgin Mary Virgin, it's always Semper Virginis. Semper Virginis. Next point, Andres, do one more.
After various experimental celebrations of the proposed rite for the study group, the Synod of Bishops and Paul VI himself, Paul VI privately approved the new order of Mass on the 6th of November, 1968.
Yes, next point, on April 3rd, 1969, by the Apostolic Constitution Missale Romanum, Pope Paul VI promulgated his Novus Ordo Missae. What year?
1969.
What day?
April the 3rd.
April the 3rd.
Was it legitimately promulgated?
No.
No. Does Bishop Fillet and the new SSPX proclaim publicly that it is legitimately promulgated?
Yes.
Yes, they do. He's proud of it. Archbishop Lefebvre said we cannot accept the word legitimate. He fought that one word, and he talks about it in a number of his conferences, that it is not legitimately promulgated. It's a lie to say so. And Father Kramer, back in 2012 in England at the London conference, he gave a great talk, actually, bashing any idea that it was legitimately promulgated. And he says it was just a bunch of thugs basically breaking in and changing the Mass. And he said that the most you can say respectfully is that Pope Paul VI autographed the printing of a new book. That's all you can really say, which was the new Mass. So on April 3rd, 69, Paul VI promulgated his Novus Ordo Mass, together with a prefatory document entitled The General Instruction on the Roman Missal. General instruction, so you'll hear a lot about that. The full Missal, with all the orations and a revised general instruction, would be published in 1970. Thus, in 1970, we arrive at the last step of the gradual process begun when?
In
1948.
Begun when?
1948.
How many years before that?
Almost 20 years.
Yes. 20 years he was chipping away. The final and complete destruction of the Mass of the Roman Rite. Accomplished. And Bonini was proud of it. He was so proud of it, he wrote his own autobiography. It's about that 4 inches thick. How all this came to be, and he describes all the meetings and his meetings with the popes, the approvals of the popes for his dirty work. They didn't catch what he was up to, certainly not Pius XII. And Don John the 23rd just kind of bought into it, but Pope Paul VI gave his whole weight behind it. So Archbishop Lefebvre mentions in one talk that I think a Cardinal Odi or Ottaviani, or one of these great cardinals, I think it was Ottaviani, who said to Archbishop Lefebvre, it's really strange because we wait and wait and wait to see Pope Pius XII. We're knocking at his door, we have to wait. But this Bonini, this Father Bonini, comes right by, knocks at the door, and he has full entrance into his office. And also with Paul VI. So he can just basically walk right in and surpass all the TSA, all the ticket counters. He can just go straight to the boss. And that was especially with Paul VI. So the cardinals were a little bit baffled by this, especially with Paul VI. So if Paul VI, as according to Father Louis, who's the one that revealed all the stuff about Paul VI? What's his name? Anyway, he put out a magazine. Well, he said he proves Paul VI was a Freemason himself. So it would stand to reason, wouldn't it? Father Bonini, a Freemason, going to see Pope Paul VI, a Freemason, and they're working together to overthrow the true Catholic Mass. Chapter 4, Latin to the vernacular, lost in translation. Pick it up, Michael. Loud and clear.
By the time the new Mass appeared in 1969, the process of putting the old Mass into the vernacular was already completed. Latin disappeared from the Mass just about everywhere in the world. From the moment this transformation began in 1964, the conservatives and progressives argued over the Vatican II, what Vatican II really meant when it dealt with the issues of Latin and the vernacular.
Yeah, so you got a big war going on all over the world. Well, Vatican II wants the Latin kept. See, it says Latin is to remain the language of the Church. But the liberals were saying no, the Vatican II allows for adaptation. So we can use the vernacular. See, it says it right in the text. However, vernacular may be used where the bishops see fit. It's a perfect example of the dichotomies and the contradiction built right into the Vatican II text. It's not from the Holy Ghost. Not at all. The Holy Ghost doesn't speak double-tongued. So, go on.
But on this question, as on so many others in the constitution of the sacred liturgy, both sides, neither side was simultaneously right and wrong. They were arguing over another vintage Vatican II formulation, written in the yes but no on one hand, on the other hand style. So on one hand, according to the Constitution, yes, Latin is to be preserved. But on the other hand, also according to the Constitution, no Latin is not to be preserved.
Okay, here's a footnote. The contested passages in the Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy are paragraphs 36, 54, and 40. Quote, 36, paragraph 1. Particular law remaining in force, the use of the Latin language is to be preserved in the Latin rites. Paragraph 2. But since the use of the mother tongue, whether in the Mass, the administration of the sacraments, or other parts of the liturgy, frequently may be of great advantage to the people, the limits of its use may be extended. This will apply in the first place to the readings and instructions and to some prayers and chants, according to the regulations on this matter, to be laid down for each case in subsequent chapters. Paragraph 54. With Article 36 of the Constitution as the norm, in Masses celebrated with the people, a suitable place may be allotted to their mother tongue. So here's the contradiction. So Latin's to be the language of the Church in the liturgy, but they can use their mother tongue, their vernacular tongue. Whenever a more extended use of the mother tongue within the Mass appears desirable, the regulation laid down in Article 40 to this Constitution is to be observed. In some places and circumstances, however, an even more radical adaptation of the liturgy is needed, and this entails greater difficulties. So there it is, blah, blah, blah. Masonic contradiction. Huh?
Lots of blah blah.
Yes, that's Vatican II. And all these modernist popes, all their encyclicals are just long, blah, blah, blah. Nothing. All right, pick it up. Okay.
If giving the mother tongue a suitable place in some parts of the Mass may be of great, quote, of great advantage to the people, unquote. Moreover, especially where, quote, an even more radical adaptation of the liturgy is needed, unquote, a more extended use of the vernacular may appear desirable.
Yeah, so there it's just jelly. Nothing's fixed. Nothing is fixed. Go on, please.
The practical,
Guadalupe, loud and clear.
The practical effect of this gobbledygook would hinge on who would interpret or define the terms advantage to the people, suitable place, and extended use. And after Vatican II, of course, this was Bonini, who wrote the Constitution, Consilium, which had the authority to interpret the Constitution, Paul VI, who backed up Consilium's decisions, and the National Bishops' Conferences, who, under the provisions of the Constitution, had the right to petition for the vernacular. Paul VI himself was an enthusiast for the vernacular. In 1969, he compared Latin in the Mass to, quote, a thick curtain, end quote, that closes the church off from children, youth, and everyday affairs. You want me to read the footnote on it?
Yes, here I'll read the footnote. Addressed to a general audience on the new order of the Mass, about to be introduced November 26, 1969, DOL 1762. Quote, this is Paul VI speaking, we are sacrificing a priceless treasure. For what reason? So he's talking about we're getting rid of Latin. So he's calling it a sacrifice, which is really camouflaging. For what reason? The answer may seem trite and prosaic, but it is sound because it is both human and apostolic. Our understanding of prayer is worth more than the previous ancient garments in which it has been regally clad. Of more value, too, is the participation of the people, of modern people, who are surrounded by clear, intelligible language, translatable into their ordinary conversation. If our sacred Latin should be like a thick curtain, close us off from the world of children and young people, of work and the business of every day, then would we, fishers of men, be wise to allow it exclusive dominion of the speech of religion and prayer? So in other words, get rid of this thick curtain blocking the view, which is Latin language, and bring in the vernacular, as if it's going to improve anything. Go on.
The image is borrowed from the fog curtain of Jungmann. Nor did he believe that a translation was a mere substitute for Latin. It was the voice of the church. Quote, the translations now, however, have become part of the rites themselves and have become the voice of the church. The vernacular now taking its place in the liturgy ought to be within the grasp of all, even children and the uneducated. End quote. From Address to Translators of Liturgical Texts of November the 10th, 1965. It was not right, Paul VI said elsewhere, quote, to make language more important than the mind's understanding, especially when it comes to divine worship and conversation with God, end quote.
Okay, so more blah, blah, blah. Here's the footnote. So he's trying to justify Vatican II's allowing the vernacular in the Mass. So go on.
For Paul VI and the institutions involved with the reform, therefore, the definition of suitable place for the vernacular seemed to mean wherever any Latin word appears. So by 1968, Latin was gone.
Latin out the window. And it sure did a lot of good for the church, didn't it? Right? With some people, I asked them, did you see the movie The Passion? They say yes. Was there even one sentence of English in there? No. Did you get what the movie was about? Yes. Did the language was not having English a barrier to understanding that movie? No. Well, that's what the Mass is. That's what the Mass is. The Mass, whether you understand it or not, it's the sacrifice of Calvary. And there's a saying, quotidiana valescunt. Daily things we do every day become vile or contemptuous, or we get used to them, and they lose their shine, so to speak. The daily humdrum. So that's another reason, a very superficial argument, but it's another reason that Latin is not just humdrum language. It's out of the ordinary. So just hearing the Latin takes you to another dimension. And it is a sacred language. So Father Urban used to call it a sacramental. The Latin language is like a sacramental, which disposes souls for grace. All right, read on, Gavril. So 1968, where's Latin?
Gone. The emergence of a younger neoconservative clergy in the 1990s and the permission granted in 2007 to use the last version of the pre-Vatican II Tridentine Missal, however, revived a certain interest in using Latin in the liturgy. Priests who used the 1962 Missal, of course, celebrate the Mass entirely in Latin, but even run-of-the-mill parishes that use the Missal of Paul VI in the vernacular will now occasionally toss in a chant or a motet in Latin.
Yeah, so a lot of new masses now throw in the Latin Sanctus, the Latin Agnus Dei, and a lot of the young priests, feel more traditional when they start using a little more Latin in their Novus Ordo Mass. So, put very simply, that's like lipstick on a pig. That's what it is, lipstick on a pig. It's an ugly beast that they're trying to make look traditional, but it's not. Okay, go on, Gavril.
The use of Latin at Mass under these circumstances, it can be safely said, has nothing to do with doctrine and everything to do with the nostalgia, aesthetics, and in the case of the Old Mass offered under the auspices of 2007 more appropriate atmosphere, what Benedict XVI called a sacrality which attracts many people.
Latin in this system is the little liturgical extra for those who find it to their taste, instead of, or indeed even sometimes along with, on eagle's wings. Negro spirituals, life-teen masses, and the rite of EWTN. So he's saying here that, Summorum Pontificum of Benedict XVI, he allowed more use of the Latin Mass, but only based on sentimental reasons, pure modernist reasons. If you're not one of the people whom sacrality attracts, well, that's fine too. Latin, a lot, a little, or none, is merely one option among thousands, all of which are more or less equal in the post-Vatican II liturgical milieu. With pastoral liturgy, the consumer is king. So there's nothing doctrinal about Pope Benedict's Summorum Pontificum, which Bishop Follet celebrated in a big way, but he didn't seem to have read it. Well, maybe he did, but he puts on an equal foot the new Mass and the Tridentine Mass, which is a blasphemy, a real blasphemy. Okay, we'll stop there. Adjutorium nostrum in nomine Domini.